Kelly arrived here with a fresh bachelor's degree back in 2009, was it? Six, right? You got your, in Michigan, from the middle of the country, and became a graduate student in the political science department here in the Women in Politics program, and found her way over to this building across the lawn almost immediately. And this is really true. We did not let her out of this building except for 1 year. And except for a few trips when some of us went to places like the Democratic National Convention in Denver in 2008, where we all went walking around and having a good time together and watching things. So she's taken a lot of those kinds of trips in the intervening years. In fact, I often see Kelly with a suitcase on her way to the airport, because she is somebody who doesn't say, and this is a big part of it, doesn't say no to anything that has to do with, can I go, can I interview, can I see, can I speak, can I attend a meeting? She has put herself out into the world as someone who cares about the subject. That's her passion, women in politics, women candidates, ever since she arrived here. And it has been such a gift. Can't speak for the graduate political science department. There are some venerable members here, and they can speak for themselves. But I can speak for Eagleton and the Center for American Women on Politics. She has been a gift to us. And we did let her out for one entire year when she became the first person, and so far the only one, I think, still from Rutgers University, who was given a congressional fellowship. And so she left. And Debbie Walsh and I were like this, oh, you think she'll come back? You think she'll come back? When she left to go to Washington for a year, where she worked on the Hill for Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro. And in fact, when she came back after the year, Rosa DeLauro, she didn't send me a nasty note, but she did on a couple of occasions tell me she was not happy that we were in competition to keep Kelly. But I hope it wasn't a tough choice for her. I don't think it was. She has been in the political science department an outstanding graduate student who's gone through and completed her dissertation. Some of her colleagues have been, her classmates have been part of some of our other programs, and they've all watched her. She just keeps going forward and finishing on schedule, and I see you're nodding, and finishing her dissertation. Her three advisors are sitting in the room like happy parents. Sue Carroll, Kira Sambamatsu, Dave Redlosk, all three who moved her along. I don't think it was hard, was it?
No, we couldn't keep up with her.
They couldn't keep up with her, Sue says. Moved her along, couldn't keep up with her, cheered her on. She finished her dissertation on time. In this building, well, she's done a lot of interviewing, but one of the moments, just a personal moment that I remember, I'm in an office on the second floor, and across the hall there's what we call the conference room, and we use it for meetings and for different purposes. And while she was working on her research, she was interviewing by telephone and in person when she could various candidates and campaign people, and she'll tell you more about that when she talks about the book. But one of the memorable evenings was I was in my office and she was across the hall with the door closed, and the person she was, and most of the time I'm kind of oblivious because I'm trying to answer the email I didn't get to all day, but she was across the hall, and the person she was interviewing at the time was Christine O'Donnell, who, if you remember, from Delaware, who was the witch from Delaware. And she's not a witch. And she actually came into the building, and Kelly made friends with her. I don't know if they see each other for coffee these days, but she came into the building. They went into that room, they closed the door, and I kind of crept out of my office a few times. I tried. But we have thick doors, and this is an old building, and it's got good walls and good doors. So she did interviews here. She has taught a class here. She has made friends throughout the Institute. And, I don't want to sound condescending, but it is really a feeling of almost like parenthood, because she came here as the beginning of a graduate career and has gone on to such an impressive academic career, now appointed, for those few of you who might not know, now appointed as an assistant professor jointly at the Camden branch of Rutgers University in the political science department, and here at Eagleton at the Center for American Women and Politics. So we plan never to let her leave, and I'm asking all of you to join us in making sure that we achieve that goal. So if you haven't seen it yet, this is the cover of the book. It's a great cover, but the contents are, in fact, better than the cover even. Not only imaginative the way the cover is, but solid research, well done, really interesting, and something that she should be, and I'm sure she is, tremendously proud of. Her committee is, all of us are, and it's just a joy to bring her back to the Eagleton podium. Kelly Dittmar. Wait, I'll take all my stuff.
You could stay, you could give the talk.
Can I say?
Yeah, sure. I'm all for that.
Maybe somebody will brush off on me and I'll write.
Oh, yeah, right. So, obviously, I want to thank Ruth for the very, very kind introduction, and I'm actually thrilled to be doing this talk at Eagleton, obviously, for the many reasons that she talked about, but also really, humbled to have Ruth introduce me. So Ruth didn't talk about it, but she's really paved the way, as have other scholars in the room, for doing this type of work. And so I'll take the minute to also plug Ruth's book in the running. And actually, for those of you who do look at my book, I did use Ruth's book to really guide my thinking about what questions would we need to ask. She wrote the book in 1981. What questions would we be asking about women running for office when I was doing my research in 2010? And what I found both interesting and also a bit depressing is that we have to ask a lot of the same questions, and we sometimes find some of the same answers. And so thank you, Ruth, for doing that work and helping to guide this work, and I hope I did you proud. Thanks to everybody at Eagleton. I can't go through the list of everybody in the room, but that has been so supportive of me for so long. To Randy, wherever she is, for helping to organize this. Thank you, Randy. Always thank you. Thank you. Thank you to all my colleagues at the Center for American Women in Politics. They have seen me at the worst points, but also helped me get through sort of the best points, and have been folks who have so much wisdom on this topic, have done this longer than I have, and have really helped to make sure, I think, and I hope, that this book is really a solid product. I want to thank, finally, I have two more groups. Thanks to all my colleagues in political science, some of whom are here today, and graduate student friends who, again, went for ice cream, got hot chocolate, et cetera, when necessary. And thank you to my committee. So without Dave Redlosk, Kira Samamatsu, Sue Carroll, this book would not have happened. And most importantly, when I came back from my congressional fellowship and said, I never want to look at this again, and they said, no, really, you should try to make it into a book. And I said, no, really, I don't want to ever look at it again. They encouraged me to do so, and they guided me through the process, which is not a particularly fun one, but is really rewarding now to have that physical book in your hands. So thank you to everybody, and thanks everybody for coming to hear a little bit about the book. So I want to begin with, some of you have seen this. I've shown it in other presentations, but I want to begin with a 2006 memo to the Hillary for President team. In this memo, Mark Penn, Clinton's top strategic advisor, presents his thoughts about voters' perceptions of gender and their preparedness for a woman president. He argues that voters are not quite ready for a, quote, first mama, but might be ready for a first father that's a woman, reflecting his philosophy on how the campaign might address, or I would argue not address, gender in Hillary Clinton's 2008 race. So today, as speculation about Clinton's next presidential campaign continues, there are many more questions about the ways in which she might navigate gender this time around. So, will she spend more time emphasizing the history-making nature of her candidacy? Will women's issues, particularly those on which she has really staked a whole career, play a more central role in her platform and in her message? And will the gender biases that she faced from the public and from the media in 2008 resurface again in 2016? Maybe. And how might she or we, as consumers of politics, respond, and scholars as well of politics respond? So I start my book and I start the talk with Hillary Clinton, not because she's a generalizable case. There is very little generalizable about her. I also don't start with Hillary Clinton because it's trendy, even though I know it's trendy to talk about Hillary Clinton. I'm the first to criticize media and commentators for acting like she's the only person we can talk about when we talk about women in politics. But here's why I do start with Clinton. It was Clinton's 2008 campaign and Penn's strategic approach that I highlighted at the start of the talk that really spurred me to begin a dissertation investigating the role that gender plays in drafting campaign strategy, and secondly, the influence that strategic and tactical decisions have on gender dynamics of campaign institutions. More importantly, my personal and somewhat academic frustration, anger, with Penn raised an important and I think more scholarly question about the particular perspectives, roles, and influence of campaign professionals or practitioners in shaping how candidates address gender throughout the campaign process. So while I don't use Clinton as a case in the book, and I don't use her as a case for the rest of this talk, I do think her campaign, whether it be 2008 or 2016, raises important questions about gender stereotypes, strategy, strategists, and gendered institutions that could be explored among other campaigns at lower levels of office or different levels of office. So this led to sort of two central questions that guide the book and my research. Recognizing the growing professionalization of modern campaigns, the Penns of the world, I ask how candidates and campaign professionals navigate the gendered landscape of today's political campaigns. And when I talk about campaign professionals, I'm talking about campaign consultants, campaign managers, and party practitioners. Secondly, I ask in what ways, if any, do their decisions and behaviors either maintain or disrupt prevailing gender dynamics and institutional norms? So those questions rest upon a central idea of the book that campaigns are in fact gendered institutions, that they're characterized by gendered relations of power, gendered culture and symbolism, and a pattern of gendered arrangements that inform behaviors of male and female actors within those institutions. So the prevailing gender order, as Joni Lewandowski has written, consists of collectively constructed values and principles that are protected and maintained by the accepted rules of the game. In politics and campaigns, those rules, which are tied directly to persistent stereotypes of both gender and of office holding, are used in the performance, production, and reproduction of gender within campaigns, particularly maintaining a gender power balance that I would argue favors masculinity in men. And so why does it matter? So I probably don't need to tell folks in this room in particular that women remain underrepresented at all levels of government. So from the presidency down, women make up less than a quarter of all elected officials in the United States, despite being over 50% of the population. More sadly, these numbers have changed very little in the past 20 years, with no significant upward trends really in the numbers of women running or winning. So we need to identify new opportunities for tackling this problem that the research hasn't before shown us. I make the case that altering internal campaign dynamics and decision-making in ways that challenge voter stereotypes of gender or challenge those rules of the game, and challenge norms of candidacy, who can be a candidate, may create new and unique opportunities for women candidates in the long term, so that we might make much more significant progress in these numbers. So in order to alter the internal campaign dynamics, we need to first understand what the heck's going on inside of campaigns. However, to understand the role of gender in campaigns, a lot of scholarship has still focused on what comes out of them. So a lot of the research and scholars that investigate gender and campaign strategy look at campaign output, which is to your right here. So they might look at campaign advertisements, campaign websites, literature that comes out of campaign to predict what the campaign was thinking about gender and why they made the decisions that they do. But nobody really, I argue in the book, has taken a step back from what we see as consumers of campaigns to ask those making campaign decisions if, how, and when gender considerations came into play in strategic formation. In doing so, you sort of overlook what I would argue is a really important phase of the campaign process, and you also overlook really important players in the process, which again are these campaign practitioners who are integral to that central phase, which is campaign strategic development. So in my book, I ask practitioners directly about their thoughts and behaviors in the strategic development phase of the campaign process to better understand why certain decisions are made about candidate image and message, and by who makes those decisions. And finally, the circularity of the model that I put forth in the book reflects my argument that campaigns can actually influence voters' expectations of ideal candidates and of gender stereotypes, either reinforcing or disrupting them based on decisions over conformity or nonconformity to the established norms. So the first and final phase on this chart, which talks about the political landscape, notes the research on norms and gender stereotypes that voters hold of male and female candidates. So we know that traits and issue expertise most often desired for office holders are also those traits and issue areas most associated with men. Scholars have debated whether or not these voter perceptions matter if women ultimately win at the same rates as men on election day. But I would argue, in line with other scholars, that this conclusion is too simplistic, and that those stereotypes do in fact matter, and they matter to the internal campaign dynamics and decision-making, again, well before election day. In essence, they influence how a campaign's developed strategy, right, that second phase, and then it informs the output we see as consumers, to your right. And finally, the expectations we're going to hold for office holders and candidates the next time they run, altering the political landscape at hand. So in the project, I make a couple of main arguments. As I mentioned already, campaigns are gendered institutions, sort of framing the book that way. I also argue that gender operates well before Election Day as candidates and campaign professionals navigate the gender terrain of political campaigns, and that gender-neutral outcomes don't actually mean that gender is absent from the process and the decisions that yield those outcomes. In fact, I write in the book at one point that the electoral effects of gender are minimal by design. Campaigns address gender in drafting and executing campaign strategy to be sure that it will not be determinative in candidates' victory or defeat. Moreover, the ways in which campaign practitioners conduct campaigns and how they understand and address voters' gender norms and expectations don't only have electoral effects, but also have institutional implications, again, for the men and women who run. And I'll talk a lot more about that at the end of the talk and my agenda for change and what you guys think about it. So just to give you a quick sense, I'm not going to go into too much of the methodology, but I just want to tell you what I did to try to answer these questions and how I got to these arguments. So in the spring of 2010, I developed and completed one of only a few national surveys of political consultants, and the only one that I know of that asks about gender. In the survey, I measured baseline perceptions of campaign professionals on voters' gender stereotypes, so what do they think voters think, and on their perceptions of effective campaign strategies for male and female candidates. I did some follow-up interviews to get at the nuance of some of their responses and also to prepare me to do the next phase of the project, which was interviews with campaign practitioners involved in races in 2008 and 2010 statewide races, where at least one candidate was a woman, so mixed gender or all-female contests. I did these interviews because I knew that for campaign professionals, they were going to be particularly averse, and I learned this as well through the survey, to speak in generalizations about gender and generic candidates. And so I had to ask these questions within the context of particular campaigns. And so that's what I did in over 80 interviews from these statewide races in 2008 and 2010, asking them about campaign strategy, decision-making, and gender dynamics in the contests in which they worked. So these professionals include candidates as well. I also interviewed some of the candidates from those races. And in the later chapters of the book, I also focus specifically on some cases more than others. And I look in chapters 5 and 6 on 6 particular campaigns in Florida, Oklahoma, and South Carolina, gubernatorial races in 2010, and California, New Hampshire, and Missouri's Senate races in the same year. So I'm going to present to you some of the highlights of my findings thematically, focusing on practitioner reports of gender dynamics in image, message, and tactical decision-making, and noting where I can the complementary conclusions from the survey results and the interview findings. I also want to make this more interesting and present some examples and stories. So I'll have some examples from 2010 and also throw in some examples from 2014 to make the case that this book is still relevant. And also to see where we might have seen some evolution even from the last time I was studying this. Also, I think it shows you how to analyze these sorts of things in the next election. So I look forward to talking more as well about other examples that you might have in the Q&A. So let me start with image. So I apologize, don't worry, I have a summary slide. So first I asked consultants to report on whether voters associated certain traits more with male candidates, more with female candidates, or about the same for both. You can see the full results on this chart. The feminine stereotypical traits are on the top, stereotypically masculine traits are on the bottom. So this is the summary. As you can see, the consultant responses were consistent with the literature on voters' gender stereotypes, that voters associated things like emotional and compassionate more with women candidates and corruption and toughness more with men. While these findings are consistent across all consultants, interestingly, there were significant partisan differences, so you can see that on the significance. Where Republican consultants were less likely to report gender differences in voter perceptions than their Democratic colleagues on 9 of the 13 traits that I asked about. So in the book, I divide some of these traits by masculine demand, masculine traits expected of candidates and office holders, and feminine advantage, stereotypical traits that may work to women's electoral advantage. And so I just want to give you a taste for some of those. So one of them that I looked at was this idea of toughness and strength, something that we talk a lot about in Women in Politics. So nearly a third of the interview subjects identified candidates' display of strength and toughness as important across all political races and climates, and that demand for strong leaders was enhanced in the difficult economic times that was faced in 2008 and 2010 when I was doing this research, particularly by the economic instability. They also noted in their interviews with me that it was especially important for executives, not a surprise, and that there were some partisan differences, that Republican men or women might be given some greater leeway or credentials on toughness over Democrats, particularly Democratic women. However, even Republican consultant Whit Ayers told me, quote, "There's more of a burden of proof on a female candidate to demonstrate that she's tough enough to do a difficult job." And so the insiders I spoke with noted that women must be more attentive to the tone that they strike in communicating toughness, and recommended using external validators for toughness, like law enforcement, to avoid the criticism of appearing too tough in their words or actions. So they discussed how women might meet this masculine demand of toughness, but do it in a way that justifies their potential disruption of gender norms of femininity, walking that fine line. So I want to give you an example. So Kelly Ayotte, who ran for the Senate in 2010, developed her toughness profile by drawing largely upon her time and associations as Attorney General of New Hampshire. Specifically, she touted her prosecution of a cop killer in multiple ads throughout the race that included both law enforcement as validators to validate her toughest credentials, and as you're going to see in this ad, family members of the slain cop with whom voters could empathize.
October 2006, Michael Briggs, a decorated Manchester police officer, responds to a domestic disturbance call.
It was the end of Michael's shift. He could have gone home, but he chose not to. Instead, he answered the call.
When he arrived on the scene, Officer Briggs was shot in cold blood, murdered.
It was the Manchester Police Department's job to bring Mike's killer in, but it was Kelly Ayotte's job to bring him to justice.
For this horrible crime, Kelly Ayotte sought and won the death penalty.
She made a lot of tough decisions on that trial.
There was nothing more important at that moment than leadership, and Kelly exuded it.
She was solid as a rock, great leader. She never backed down on anything.
There hasn't been an attorney general in my 21 years who has been more respected by law enforcement than Kelly Ayotte.
She's just a fighter. I mean, just like my son was.
Justice was done, and Kelly's the one who did it.
I'm Kelly Ayotte, and I approve this message.
So in this ad and in other ads that she used to, she had 30-second versions of this, and she used the same ad really throughout a lot of the race. She not only benefited from the twofer of experience and endorsements, but she paired that tough behavior with a heinous crime, right? In this sense, her toughness was not only effective, but it was also justified, right? This was a cop killer. And so I find this case particularly exemplary of that discussion. So the masculine demands of campaign institutions, however, don't preclude some distinct advantages of femininity, according to the folks that I spoke with. In fact, when asked specifically about potential gender advantages or disadvantages for men and women candidates, over half of my interview subjects identified potential benefits of voters' feminine expectations for women candidates, including voters' association of women candidates more often with honesty, authenticity, and a propensity for change. So candidates and their teams noted these benefits across different levels of office, Senate or gubernatorial, and across party. Democratic consultant Rich Davis told me, quote, "There's a presumption that women are less likely to get into trouble, women are less likely to mislead us, and women are more likely to tell the truth." And he saw this firsthand in a race that he ran in 2010 for Florida gubernatorial candidate Alex Sink. In that race, Sink and her team drew upon a 30-point advantage, 30 points, that she held throughout the race on traits of honesty and integrity against her opponent, who she contrasted on this, Rick Scott, who's now the governor, with a theme of leading with honesty and integrity, very original. She put out an ad against Rick Scott called Integrity, which I've clipped here, where she highlighted the scandals surrounding Rick Scott and assured Floridians that she would be nobody's governor but theirs. She affirmed their beliefs that she's not only honest, but she's also empathetic to their experiences and to the demands of the Florida's constituents. Interestingly as well, just as another note of something I talk about in the book, she also, in all of her ads, spoke directly to the camera. And she did this for two reasons. One, to emphasize, again, authenticity. And secondly, as her strategist told me, to be sure that voters knew she was a woman. And so with a name like Alex that is gender neutral, they knew that they wanted to play up this advantage that was gender-based, and so they made sure that she was in all the ads. So folks knew that Alex was, in fact, a woman. So while Sink's advantages in these domains didn't land her in the governor's mansion, as I mentioned, they did influence her campaign strategy. And that's part of my point in this process, that it matters how it informs the strategy along the way. However, she also demonstrated the challenge for women in taking advantage or amplifying existing stereotypes. So if you violate those norms that you've now lifted up, you have a harder fall, as Celinda Lake says often, from the pedestal. And so in a debate just before Election Day, Sink broke a rule by looking at an aide's iPhone during a commercial break. Immediately after the break, Scott accused her of cheating. And then he quickly aired radio ads questioning her integrity, and thus questioning the foundational image that she had put forth to voters. So let me just play this radio ad.
So, you're the only house on the cul-de-sac without a sign. Who's it gonna be, Sink or Scott?
That's me, Miss Undecided.
How are you gonna decide? Did you watch the debate?
On CNN?
Yeah.
I did.
Did you see Alex Sink get caught cheating?
You mean when CNN caught her breaking the debate rules and getting a note from her coach?
Cheating. Hilarious.
Well, here's what's not funny. Alex Sink's debate coach is a lobbyist.
The same guy who gave her the note in the debate?
Yep, he's a lobbyist for the insurance industry that Sink is supposed to be regulating.
That's who's pulling Alex Sink's strings? Lobbyists? And it looked like Sink needed some more coaching.
She did have trouble explaining about all her new spending. Right about that.
If Alex Sink is going to spend billions more, you know who's going to pay for it.
We are.
Yeah, reminds me of another candidate we saw not so long ago.
You're right about that. Barack Obama.
Hope, change, and here's the big spending.
That's Alex Sink.
Political advertisement paid for and approved by Rick Scott, Republican for governor.
Good stuff. There's so much to analyze about that. There's so much more we could say. But what I want to point out, the one piece that I want to pull out, I mean, it was women, there was a lot going on there. But while her cheating in a debate, and while that radio ad alone did not make her lose the race, there were a lot of other reasons why she lost that race, it did hurt. And I would argue it hurt more because it was that fall from the pedestal that is farther for women. That these stereotypes place women, that building up on these stereotypes can place women higher on this pedestal, thus when they violate it, it's even more harmful. And I think it shows the danger that women or men can have in replicating gender stereotypes instead of challenging them. So in trying to play up her gender-based advantage, there's also some risks to that. And I think this particular case shows that. In the survey, I also asked specifically about consultants' perceptions of whether or not male and female candidates would do better to use family differently in candidate images and presentations. And so, if you do get Ruth's book and read it, you will, you'll hear questions about what do you do with family and what role does family play in campaigns. And some later work has also looked at this. And so, it's a question we often ask. And there's anecdotal discussions as well that have focused on the additional burden that women may have in dealing with young children during a campaign, so questions like who's going to take care of your kids, and also with spouses, questions like who's really in charge and who's really running. So while the majority of consultants argued in the survey that family worked about the same for men and women candidates, the second most common responses to each area is consistent with what I would have expected from the literature, that male candidates have an easier or more successful time presenting themselves with spouses or children. When the candidates' children are grown, practitioners report the least likelihood of gender differences and how voters would respond, which is expected. In interviews, however, practitioners provided much greater detail about how these perceptions might inform their recommendations of candidate imaging. So they discussed how somewhat different benefits of family on the trail, that there are somewhat different benefits of family on the trail for men and women, but overall noted it as an area of greater complexity at the least for women. So for men, family, wives, children, mothers in many cases, communicated family values and reflected their masculine leadership as head of households. In particular, there is a potential for what Durslati and Kelly refer to as spousal reflection, where a feminine spouse helps to affirm a male candidate's masculinity. As a Republican consultant, Scott Schweitzer told me of women candidates, you are never trying to show that she's a devoted wife. In other words, the spousal reflection mechanism does not work in reverse to women's advantage. For women then, family, especially children, can evoke empathy, and particularly in the case of motherhood, might in fact provide alternative credentials to leadership. And so, using again, Kelly Ayotte as an example, I want to show one of Kelly Ayotte's campaign advertisements in which she explains how Washington's wasteful spending is stealing from her children's futures. While her voiceover rhetoric in the ad is pretty tough, the image you see is Ayotte ultimately playing in the park with her young children, combining what I would argue are maternal images of warmth with the strength that she needs to hold the office. So let me show you this.
People sometimes ask me why I'm conservative. Well, it starts with the fact that I'm a prosecutor, not a politician. Plus, I come from a military family. My husband Joe was a fighter pilot in Iraq. Joe and I started his small business together, so I know the value of a dollar. And of course, our kids help make me really conservative. All that wasteful spending is stealing money from our children because they'll have to pay for it. I'm Kelly Ayotte. I'm a conservative who will cut spending, and I approve this message.
So, in an interesting way, I would argue that strategies like hers actually shift the masculine role of protector to a feminine image of mother. Instead of using her maternal role just to display warmth and tradition, she associates motherhood with strength and security, and in this ad in particular, her motherhood is used as a source for conservative credentials. And so insiders who talked to me about family said, you know, it's a lesser burden than it was to women in elections past. And maybe that's in part because of these sorts of approaches. Ones that I would argue present an example of how campaigns' decisions can actually challenge prevailing norms and provide some alternative opportunities for women running in the future. So let me show you one more example of this. So in 2014, one of Gina Raimondo's most successful ads for governor of Rhode Island was narrated and starred her daughter, Cece. The ad's purpose was to communicate her economic plan, but to do so from the perspective of a mother seeking the best not only for Rhode Island, but also for her kids.
Hi, this is our mom, Gina Raimondo. And Mom talks about her jobs plan all the time. So we thought we'd show it to you. She started a business that helped create over 1,000 jobs. As governor, she'll bring colleges and businesses together to create more marine science, healthcare, and manufacturing jobs. She'll rebuild roads, bridges, and schools. And finally do something with this 195 land. Tommy thinks all that could help fill the Superman building.
One of the best ads. One of the best ads of the cycle. So from conversations we had with insiders about this ad, the ad was effective in communicating empathy. And most interestingly, it didn't elicit any backlash. By pushing the boundaries, the Raimondo campaign found that voters, at least in Rhode Island, could envision a mother with young kids sitting in the governor's office, right? And so this showed some evolution in the strategies that we sometimes recommend to women candidates. So the next section of findings that I want to talk about are about message. So in surveying consultants, I asked about their perceptions of voters' associations with certain issue expertise areas to male and female candidates. Again, finding consistency with the actual beliefs among voters, which is a good thing. And this chart shows all the responses to the different issues I asked about. Excuse me. With stereotypically feminine issues, again, on the top, and stereotypically masculine issues on the bottom. To summarize this, consultants reported that voters are more likely to attribute issue expertise to women on social issues, education, healthcare, and family policy. They attribute expertise to men on national security, defense, and foreign policy. Again, Republican consultants were more likely than Democratic consultants to argue that men and women were attributed similar levels of expertise across issue areas, particularly on 7 of the 11 issues they were asked about. And this partisan difference also continues in the interview responses. Interestingly, neither Republican nor Democratic consultants perceived immigration or the environment to be particularly gendered issues, and I think that's relevant, at least in the sense that these are issues that are likely to get a lot of attention of late, of course. The survey finding on economic expertise is particularly significant finding when we look at the landscape on which 2010 was waged, but also even more recently to our latest elections, where jobs and the economy are the dominant issues for all of the campaigns I studied. Consultants I spoke with emphasized the importance for women in demonstrating their economic credentials in very specific ways, unlike their male opponents for whom it was often assumed that they had economic expertise. As Celinda Lake told me, men have an economic plan and it's like, yahoo, they have an economic plan for this state. Women have a plan and it's like, well, who else supports the plan? Who endorsed the plan? So practitioners encourage their female candidates to tout endorsements of their economic plan and credentials from others, including men, as well as outlining the plan in great detail on their websites to prove their substance, and deter any criticism or doubts of their expertise. And so here's an example from the races I studied. So in the Maine gubernatorial race, this is primary candidate Rosa Scarcelli, who was running on the Democratic primary. She told me that folks assumed she was, quote, just another pretty face, and that she contended with that by putting out a book-length economic plan endorsed by leaders of the state. Now, mind you, she was CEO of her own successful real estate management firm, but still felt the need to put this out, again, in book length. So this was about 100 pages. In 2014, Mary Burke built her campaign around an economic agenda as well. She was a top executive at Trek Bicycles, and she spent much of her time hiring experts to ensure that she presented a solid plan to voters, in addition to touting, again, her business credentials from her time at Trek. This was particularly important for her in contrasting her opponent in this race, which was Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. But her case also presents, again, the challenge for women. When her expertise on economic issues was questioned, which it was, and it was questioned pretty hard. She was discredited because there was evidence of plagiarism in her plan, although speaking with folks after, right, if you saw the whole plan, it was a small piece of her plan, but she was accused of plagiarizing. It created a huge fumble in her campaign and took her off message. And then, after not dealing very well with the plagiarism charges, they then came out and said, her opponent said, that she was fired from her role at Trek, and that the CEO actually confirms this. After the fact, this was just sort of a week or two before the campaign ended, after the fact there's sort of evidence that she wasn't in fact fired, but her opponent knew that he could mine this vein of attack. Right? That all he needed to do was be sure that he mined the vein that she did not have the economic credentials to do the job. And again, I would argue that some of that may have been easier because the expectation to begin with was that she might not have had the experience to do this job, even though she had a resume to show it. So all that she did was still sort of taken away in the end of the race, and questions about her skills to run a state budget were pretty strong. So I think her case and others were exemplary of women's need to meet higher demands on many dimensions via messaging, in emphasizing their experience and credentials for office. Ann Liston, who is a Democratic media consultant, noted the almost tacit acceptance of this by insiders when she said, "There's a standard that's different between male and female candidates, and more is expected of female candidates. This is just sort of the world we live in." So I would reflect on these comments and argue maybe we don't need to live in that kind of world, and maybe we need to find out ways to change it. And so that's what we'll talk about at the very end. In addition to strategic decision-making about candidate image and message, campaigns also make internal decisions about how to communicate those images and messages to the public via tactics. So I talk about this in more detail in the book. The tactical decisions have direct implications, I would argue, again, for upholding or upending masculine imagery of political candidates and the masculine rhetoric of political campaigns. So Burton and Shea, who wrote the book Campaign Craft, write, "Consultants who use the same tricks of the trade over and over again might have a homogenizing effect on American politics." And I talk about two tactical areas in the book for men and women that, in regard to this idea of homogenization and how we might sort of be using these same rules of the game or applying the same rules of the game. So one tactical approach that I discussed in the book is going negative, reporting practitioner perceptions of negative campaigning, particularly by and against women candidates. Political science literature has probed the likelihood and electoral impact of going negative for men and women candidates with some mixed findings. When I asked consultants specifically about whether or not men need to tread carefully in attacking female opponents, 63% of them agreed that men need to use some more caution when running against a woman candidate. In my interviews, even more, a greater percentage of them told me the same thing, though their perceptions varied in just how much caution was needed. In many of the cases I analyzed, the highest degrees of prudence were actually self-imposed by the male candidates themselves. And they noted things to watch for, like their language or their tone, or being in settings in which they were directly interacting with their female opponent. Bill Kenyon, who is a Republican media consultant, told me, quote, "The male candidate's still got to be considered a gentleman, even more so when you have a female opponent." And let me just give you one example of a candidate. Terry Goddard, who is the Attorney General of Arizona, was running against Jan Brewer. And he went into great detail with me about being concerned that it would look like he was bullying a woman, especially an older woman, if in a debate format, which in his case they were sitting across the table from each other, if he attacked her on lies that she was saying during the debate. And he said, I just didn't want to look like a bully, so I held back. And that was just one example. Another example from South Carolina was where a number of the consultants told me that their Republican male candidates were particularly nervous about going negative against Nikki Haley, especially in debates when she was the only woman on the stage with them. And so this sort of caution came up repeatedly. A second tactical area that I outline in greater depth in the final substantive chapter in the book is targeting women voters, and I outline what I perceive to be male compensation strategies where men try to make up for women's perceived advantage among women voters in mixed gender contests, and female amplification strategies where women candidates appeal to women as an area of perceived natural advantage, often sort of doing less because they assume, again, that it's a natural area of advantage. So you can think about these, male compensation strategies may come through the recruitment of women voters, so women for Rosenthal, women for, some sort of group like that. Use of spousal surrogates, endorsements from women, especially endorsements from women's groups, or reclaiming policy territory, like talking about equal pay or education. Female amplification might be through women's issue appeals, empathetic appeals using family or motherhood, like we saw before, or also using other female messengers. All right. So, a few major conclusions from the book. So hopefully I demonstrated both in the book and in this talk that campaigns are in fact gendered institutions and that gender dynamics are at play well before Election Day, and also where and how gender stereotypes might matter in shaping campaign strategy. The one interesting finding that I didn't necessarily expect when going into the book was seeing also the partisan differences, where Republican and Democratic insiders differ in the extent to which they perceive gender differences in today's political terrain. And I would argue that that matters, and it matters for Republican and Democratic women who are running and those who are giving them advice. So as I begin the talk, I want to end by making the case that practitioner perceptions shape strategic decisions with the potential for electoral and institutional outcomes. So in making the case that practitioners can ultimately inform institutional gender power dynamics, I challenge what one campaign practitioner I interviewed told me. He said, "I'm not a social change agent here. I'm a campaign manager and I gotta win." And I get that, right? Thankfully, I know enough practitioners, and I know that this is the most important thing. But I would argue that in working toward electoral victory, candidates and their teams do, in fact, have the capacity to make lasting institutional change, whether they know it or not. By offering, shaping, and applying new rules of engagement in political contests, in addition to bringing new voices to the table in decision-making, campaigns' most prominent actors can put forth and advance a transformative agenda that has long-term implications for disrupting institutional gender norms, with some short-term benefits of shifting values and images of office holders. So in the book, I outlined 5 different steps that I think we could take or think about to transforming and changing or disrupting institutional gender dynamics and norms about what we think about who can be or should be a candidate. So the first is, it's not simply knowing what voters think or expect of gender and awareness of gender stereotypes that matters for effective and innovative strategy. It may often be that the 2 attributes, sort of knowing a lot about gender, is not enough. Falling into gendered rules of the game instead of offering new ones can be just as replicative as overlooking that campaigns are gendered at all. So we need to push folks to be more aware of the nuances of gender and, again, the institutional outcomes of applying gender rules of the game. Secondly, when the pool of campaign professionals looks like this, it's no wonder why we might experience institutional replication, especially as it relates to gender dynamics and norms instead of institutional change. So as institutional actors themselves, women may be better situated to understand the hurdles that women face and different strategies for addressing them. Previous research has also shown that women may be more committed to equality and gender change, and in that way they might be what I've been calling, using among other scholars' work, gender equity entrepreneurs with the access, awareness, attentiveness, and incentive as women in the institution to change the gender norms in that institution. So in paying attention to future races like Clinton 2016, we might want to see who's at the strategic table and the diversity among them. And it might make a difference to presenting new routes toward electoral success and institutional evolution. The third idea is for institutional disruption. A lot of what I've been talking about throughout the whole talk. Practitioners and candidates' willingness to challenge prevailing institutional norms of masculinity is vital to redefining gender in campaigns so that men and women can offer unique styles of leadership, campaign messages and images, and tactical approaches to campaigns that are deemed equally appropriate for political office, and similarly likely to be exercised or adopted by men or women. So I just want to give one example of a case in which we are not disrupting institutional gender norms from 2014. So I would argue that there's two sides of this, right? You disrupt norms or you maintain them. And in this case, I think we see a little bit of institutional maintenance.
Mitch McConnell wants you to think I'm Barack Obama. Mitch is the same guy who thought Duke basketball players were UK, or who's attacking me on coal after doing next to nothing while we've lost thousands of coal jobs. He even said it's not his job to bring jobs to Kentucky.
I'm not Barack Obama. I disagree with him on guns, coal, and the EPA. And Mitch, that's not how you hold a gun. I'm Alison Lundergan Grimes, and I approve this message.
So, in this ad, I think Grimes can actually be perpetuating gender norms of the office, valuing masculinity so much that you try to emasculate the male candidate. These sorts of tactics are not new and have been used by men against men for over 100 years. And it's seen not just in 2014, but in the races I studied, where women said things like, put your big boy pants on, or man up. And in these cases, men and women candidates can then be equally culpable of perpetuating harmful gender rules of the game. And so, in the idea of disruption would be noting the importance of revaluing traits, issue expertise, and attributes expected of candidates to permit alternative models and images of appropriateness and electoral success. So the motherhood examples that I gave are just one set of examples that you could use here. Finally, external forces also provide potential sites for institutional change, especially in how internal actors choose to react to and address them via campaign strategy. So insiders explain to me the influence of political parties, external funders, women's organizations, the media, all of these as external forces on campaigns' victory or defeats. In addition to influencing electoral outcomes, these actors are sometimes directly influential in internal campaign decision-making or strategizing, and again, thus have an influence on institutional change. So I put up here a lot of the women's organizations that I work with, including our own, Ready to Run, as a campaign training, because I think it means that we all need to think more seriously about what we tell women candidates they need to do. So we often tell them what the rules of the game are, and sometimes we are just equally culpable in perpetuating the rules as they stand today. So lastly, while campaigns are motivated by victory alone, I contend that the long-term investment, which is what I call it in the book, to institutional change and innovation translates into beneficial electoral effects. In other words, altering the gender power dynamics in campaigns will better position female candidates to run and win, in addition to providing alternative sites for credentials, attributes, and engagement for both men and women candidates. In regendered campaign environments, victory would result from not only institutional maintenance, but institutional disruption over adaptation to institutional gender norms. For women especially, that means redefining gender norms instead of replicating them, by challenging the masculinity of political offices and the expectations of appropriate feminine behavior for women by women who run. So Whitpagan and Matthews, who also wrote a great book about running as a woman, provide a useful term for what this change could and should lead to, which are campaigns in which women can enter and compete, quote, on their own terms, instead of the gender-defined terms that shape electoral contests today. So thank you for bearing with me, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
We are filming today for our YouTube channel, so I have a microphone that I will pass around the room. Please just tell us your name and where you're from. And Professor Dittmar, I will defer to you for who you would like to take a question from.
All right. And then there's one back there.
Hi, I'm Mark Major. I'm a Rutgers graduate alum. I went to graduate school with Kelly, and now I'm at Penn State University. How does this work for the Mia Loves of the world? Because all of your examples are white women. So how does this work for African American or Latina candidates?
So sadly, as my advisors know, what I kept coming up against in terms of even doing this analysis is that when we look at candidates for statewide office, we're looking at a very white group to begin with, especially among the women, but more broadly. So I don't have racial diversity in my sample in the cases that I studied simply because they weren't there. But it doesn't mean, I do think your point, right, is taken that what I would argue, though I would need to do the analysis, right, is that you would now have, as much as I talk about the gender dynamics of campaign institutions, there's also race dynamics of these institutions, and you have to look at the interaction of those two and what we know about the interaction of race and gender stereotypes and how those present additional rules of the game and different rules of the game for women like Mia Love or others. Now, she has sort of even more so the challenges of being sort of averse to her party expectations, right? The idea that as a black woman she would be presumed to be a Democrat. So she's contending many stereotypes at one time. And so it would actually be really fascinating to talk to her campaign strategist and how they dealt with that. But I don't have good examples from this work because of the dearth of candidates. But good point.
Hi, I'm Dolores Phillips. I am a Rutgers alum, but I also worked in the environmental political arena for 20 years. Part of that, and what I did, I ran a PAC, an environmental PAC, for 9 years, which was quite an eye-opener. Hopefully I'm still looking for the notes so I can write a book about this.
Great.
But my question is, what were your criteria for finding the consultants that you interviewed? Because I am real interested in what your criteria were and how you made those decisions.
Sure. So sort of two different sets of criteria for the consultants who were in the survey versus the consultants who I interviewed for the cases. So it's easier for the cases, so I'll answer that first. So I could pretty easily find out who were the consulting teams for each of the campaigns that I was studying. So starting at the campaign level and then determining who was hired by that campaign to be a consultant. And then often it also meant using a sort of snowball. So if I talked to the pollster for that campaign, they would then also tell me maybe who else I should speak to from the campaign. So that's how I got the consultants for the interviews for the cases. For the survey, it was much more difficult because this is sort of a population that changes every cycle. And so I used a sort of complicated method, which I won't get into all the details, but at the time, the Campaigns and Elections did a political resources directory. And so you could use that to look at who was hired, at least in any given cycle. And then I went through all of the consulting firms who did strategic consulting, and then went to each individual webpage and called and found out who were the top strategic consultants at that firm. And then got their contact information and included them in my sample. So it was a bit of an arduous task to do that. But it was worthwhile because I learned that's why people don't survey consultants. But it was interesting to sort of find that out. And actually, in doing that, you also learn more about the industry, right? So in going page to page, you see how these firms are set up and what their titles are and things like that. So just as a side note, I learned that the Campaigns and Elections no longer does that directory. So I don't know how I'm going to do the next survey is the answer. But good question.
Hi, my name is Sarah. Thank you so much. I was curious about what you found about the consultants and the gender makeup of those people as well, because who's then putting out the images about these women?
Thank you for setting up my next question. So this is sort of the rough breakdown based on the way I found the consultants. Of the population, it was broken down by about 75% of the population being men, 25% being women of strategic consultants. And I say strategic because this world is actually very gendered in the sense that fundraisers are primarily women. So if you include all political consultants, you'll have sort of different numbers. But if you take out fundraisers, because I'm interested, again, in who's shaping candidate image and message. What my survey showed was about 75%, 25%. A few other surveys that have surveyed consultants have shown about the same breakdown, so I feel like it's pretty accurate. And then when you talk to consultants, they feel like that's pretty accurate. And I also actually asked the consultants in my survey to give me percentages, and again, it sort of goes around this 3/4 of them being men. So to get to your question, I would very much argue that makes a difference. And I actually, in the interviews and in the survey, asked particular questions about being gender differences in the profession of consulting and how that might influence strategy. And so I have some initial findings on that, and showing that they would argue it does make some differences, particularly the women I talk about the difference it made to have them at the table, and the hard, the way they experienced the institution, which was many of the similar challenges that women candidates face in sort of getting into and passing through hurdles and meeting questions about their credentials and all of these things. Again, they operate within the same gendered institution. And so I think for me, sort of the next questions in this area are really asking whether or not women can be what I would argue are gender equity entrepreneurs. Can they actually be even more helpful in making the change that I'm sort of arguing for? And how do you both get them into the profession? And then if anybody has any ideas, how you study their behavior and how it might differ from men. So I think my hypothesis is it makes a difference, and some of the evidence shows it does. The last thing I'll just say on that is that the reason that that's not in the book is because there were so few women. And so, as any good social scientist knows, my N was too small. And so, which is frustrating because it actually proves the point, right, that they're not in the profession. So that's a challenge.
Hi, I'm Jessica. I'm a senior and an undergraduate associate through the program at Eagleton. I just had a question. So you, there was a quote a little while ago that you put up that was about someone said, I don't need to kind of be transformative. I'm just trying to win a campaign. I'm not creating social change. And so my question is, especially, I guess I'm not sure if I read the quote wrong because I'm reading it kind of if it's from the perspective of running the campaign of a male. So do you think it's realistic that if men are winning through using gender stereotypes, is it realistic to expect them to change? And if not, can women in their campaigns run on a transformative sort of platform without gender stereotypes and overcome those stereotypes, or does it need to change in both the campaigns of men and women?
By both men and women, right. So this is the practitioner response, right, which is again, we have to win. So that's all great that you want to change institutions, right? But we have to win in November. So I can't be worried about whether or not I'm perpetuating stereotypes if that's what voters expect. But I guess sort of the case that I make in response to that is that if you actually change voters' minds in small ways along the way, right, sort of that incremental change, again, you have a long-term benefit as a practitioner because you've now allowed for a broader set of credentials or a broader set of images of what a candidate could be or what they can run on. And that benefits men or women. So a couple of the consultants I spoke with talked about this in that sort of broad way. And I will argue that many of them were women. But, in thinking about, well, if we expand the way that a woman can run, for example, if we just use motherhood as this example, right, and we say, she can use this as a credential for office, that also means that it expands the way men might talk about parenthood, not just sort of being head of household, but that they too, care about their kids' future and they care about education and all of these things, so that it could matter equally for men and women. To your question about, I guess, if only women did it, could they do it at the same time as men? I think you're right. I mean, I think there's no candidate is going to take a risk and let their sort of opponent, sort of adapt to the existing rules of the game and win. So it does have to be sort of across the board that there has to be some incentive. But I think, the flip side of that, again, finally, is just that there's not necessarily a negative of this, right? So just by disrupting gender stereotypes doesn't mean that you're going to lose or you're going to hurt voters. What you see is that voters actually can respond quite well. Yeah. Yeah.
My name is Marcy, and I really appreciate your effort and your clarification on the gender issues. As I listen to you, I have a sense, however, that the consultants are not going to make the changes that we want, and that we as women in the society have to begin to be more assertive and clear, and when we stand for office, make certain that we're clear about our agenda and we stay with the agenda. And I think in that way, attributes, whether they're male or female, we want someone in an office that is going to listen, that is going to be creative, that is going to make decisions. And these are the things that I think are going to have a greater effect. What's your feeling about that?
Sure. I mean, I guess if you're asking, right, are there sort of overall sort of credentials that voters have for men and women candidates, right? A sort of baseline of things that voters care about most. I think that's true. I just think the ways in which voters sometimes digest that information. So if we talk about your expertise, or if you're going to go in and get the job done, sometimes there's a higher bar that we have for women candidates. And so does it still mean that in that process of campaigning that they have to sort of credential themselves in a number of different ways to meet that voter expectation that you're talking about? So, I mean, I don't know if that answers exactly what you're asking, but I think that there are sort of general credentials that are true across male and female candidates. As to your point about consultants and whether or not they're going to buy this, I think, right, that's, as I mentioned in the last question, I think that they are concerned primarily with winning. But I do think they're open. These are folks who are, many of them, who do have some academic backgrounds, who have an expertise in public behavior and are interested in the ways in which campaigns might actually be influential on voters as well, right? They're trying to manipulate voters in many ways. And so in this way, we're just saying, well, you can manipulate voters in this way, which is to push the boundaries a little bit. And so I think you can make the case to them. I can't say it's going to work, but I think I'm a little more optimistic about it. I think Marilia.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Dr. Dittmar. I'm happy to be here as your former student, and I'd like to congratulate you on your important research. My question is, as a female and mom, you talked about the implications of political campaigns extending the campaigns, right? They have institutional impacts way beyond the campaign. So my question for you is, as a future leader who's interested in public service, what are ways that I can frame my message to kind of, debunk the institutional, replications of gender inequality?
Yeah. That's a great question. Okay. Really, see, this puts me on the spot because I have to actually really give good answers. But I think that, so I think there's a lot of ways you can do this, right? I would first say that one thing we sort of need to say to both men and women candidates, which actually gets to your question a little bit, is about being true to yourself, right? Whatever your sort of story and your traits and qualifications are. The idea and the hope would be that you can actually run a campaign where you run on those instead of what voters supposedly want you to be. And so first being understanding for yourself what you would want to start out running on and what you would want to be. And then pushing against what you're going to get. So if you're running a campaign and you're hiring campaign professionals and they're concerned about gender dynamics or gender stereotypes or gender norms, they're going to tell you X, Y, and Z things that you need to do as a woman candidate. And you have to pick and choose which of those you think you need to do to win and which of those you might be able to sort of push the boundaries on. And so, again, those could be small things like how you present your family, how you present your biography, what sort of credentials you use to talk about in office. But the Alison Lundergan Grimes example is a sort of overt one, which is, well, let's not engage in the same gender norms against our opponents so that I can win, right? So I think it's both on your own side and also how you relate with your opponents. So I'll be your strategist when you run, and we'll talk very specifically about it. Yeah.
Excuse me. Yeah. Therein lies the problem. Therein lies the issue with campaigns.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. I just had to butt in because I just wanted to say to the person considering running is that having been on the inside of this, that what happens from the very beginning is the campaign manager and the party. And if you don't have enough personal strength and knowledge, you're completely manipulated by the campaign manager and afraid of them.
Well, but also depending on
unless
who you
have
hire.
knowledge and who you hire.
I mean, that's it too, right? So I hope what this research at the very base shows is that these people matter. And so you need to choose, if you're running a campaign, you need to know who your practitioners are and what their experience is with women candidates, and do you like what they've had other candidates do? So I think you're right that there's a danger and there's going to be a tendency to do that, but they're not all bad people. Some of them are really great people. And so you just need to choose who's right for you too. Yeah. Hey.
Hi, my name is Francine. I'm an undergraduate associate. My question is, are there any strategies that women politicians who are running or are already elected have taken to debunk gender stereotypes that maybe have successfully done this or are on their way to successfully doing this?
Sure. So I hope that what some of these examples show is what I sort of argue is evolution. So that we see women, I mean, look, the Gina Raimondo example I get all excited about because I think that it does debunk that sort of standard line of women can't show their kids and they're going to be questioned and it's going to create all this backlash. In fact, her daughter was front and center throughout the whole campaign. Now, you could argue on the flip side, is that over sort of feminizing her, right? We can have a really good debate about that. But I do think what it did was, it sort of pushed the envelope to say, sure, some people might say that this is a challenge, but let me show you that when I do this, people actually see the advantage of this. They empathize with me on this point. They can see me both as governor and as mother simultaneously. These things don't necessarily have to not coincide. Outside of I gave a couple of motherhood examples just as ways to show alternative credentials. But I do think, so I'm going to be really popular in the room. So I actually argued with Sue Carroll that Sarah Palin actually pushed the boundaries on multiple levels, some of it being really simple. So being willing to go out there and wear different sorts of clothes when you're running for office and not sort of fall into whether we like pantsuits or not, but fall into sort of the expectations of what you need to wear or look like or the hair you need to have. That's just really one small way in which you push the images and expectations of what it means to be a candidate. So I think she did that. I think she did that a little bit too with her kids and family as well, and talking about different credentials for office. I think some of the younger women who are running also present some good examples of how you they talk about their own personal lives and their commitments to office in a little bit of a different way than you might if you said, I was a mother and I wanted a stop sign and all of that. They have different stories, and I think that also changes our images and expectations. So I think there are some really good examples. So I am optimistic that we are sort of seeing some shift in the institution itself.
Just on that point, I want to ask you something else.
I said
but just
Sarah
on-
Palin.
No, it's not on Sarah
Ruth got
Palin.
up. She was like...
No, I'm not going to argue about that. What I am doing is going back to, you waved around a very old book, and I'm going to go back to what I remember was so striking, and that was the women who didn't have families. So remember that? So this goes back all those years. They kind of hired kids to take pictures with. The woman who was not married, didn't have children, so she used her nieces and nephews because...
Which still happens.
The question about her was, is she a real woman, or is she... and that goes all the way back. So it's what I argued and still do is, walking that fine line between being, whatever the image is, the stereotypes are on one side or another, it's a very narrow line. Question I want to ask you, though, is, so you went into this, right, hypothesis, assuming that campaigns were gendered institutions, right? That was
Well, I'm a
going
good social
in.
science. It was just my hypothesis.
Right, it was your hypothesis. So
did not
and you
assume
discovered that was right, in fact. A good social scientist, you found the evidence, right? What I want to know is what surprised you? Name a couple of things that you didn't expect to find that surprised you.
Yeah, the party differences was the biggest surprise. And because quite honestly, I was just as pessimistic that it would be on both sides of the aisle, right? So again, as I mentioned to you, that the pen memo and frustration was what got me into the project. So I assumed that sort of this population of folks, which was male-dominated, and again was concerned primarily with winning and things like this, that you would see that their gender perceptions were about the same, and that there was less of sort of that nuanced thought about gender dynamics that I would argue is necessary in order to see some change. So the partisan difference and the persistence of them, and also I think in interviews, which is the beauty of doing interviews, the willingness of them to just say, like, nah, it makes no difference. Just makes no difference at all. And then, so there's a chapter in the book where what I do, and hopefully I trace it well, is I was really trying to show that they say no, and then you ask them more, and they tell you all the ways in which gender matters. And so I did my best to show that conversation sort of happening. So again, that first answer is no, gender doesn't matter. That's, of course, no, right? As if gender mattering is always a bad thing. So this idea of gender neutrality is really raised as that's what we're shooting for. And then, again, I would ask, well, did it matter in debates? Did it inform your decision-making about paid media? Did you think differently about women voters? And on all those things, they would say, well, yeah, I guess there. And I guess this mattered. And I guess I thought about that a little bit. And so that was surprising to me, and also the honesty with which sometimes they talked about it. They were pretty blunt with me, which I wasn't sure going in, and my advisors and I, we sort of worried about, like, how honest are these folks going to be? And I really think they were. So I guess that was sort of one of the biggest surprises, partisan differences and also sort of the evolution of their answers. Yeah.
Mike? I'm sitting here listening to some of the talk about, the important thing is to win. And a very gendered image is coming to mind, which is the Hail Mary pass. That it's the campaigns where you might, you have to believe you're going to win, but somewhere in your heart you know you're really not. But it's those campaigns where you might do something radical. So you might be Fritz Mondale and come up with a Jerry Ferrara, or you might be Shirley Chisholm and say, I'm running for president my way, knowing full well she wasn't going to be president. Whether the campaigns where there really is that big gap and you're not likely to win might be the ones where you can really do different things.
Yes. So I don't know, this doesn't speak exactly to that, because I think at the time she thought she was going to win. But I do think that there was an interesting sort of set of cases in 2014. So in the Pennsylvania gubernatorial race with Alison Schwartz, where she put out an ad, for those of you who didn't see it, that basically said, I'm taking on the old boys club. And it's her speaking at a podium, and very much takes on directly gender and the uniqueness. Of course, her sort of motivation here was to sort of stand out as the woman candidate, but takes it on in a way that you would previously say women candidates would be concerned about sort of being seen as playing the gender card. And she did it very overtly. She did not win, so after the fact, you might see it as more of one of these things, maybe she just didn't care. I don't think that's actually true in their decision making. But it was sort of an interesting case of, could she push that envelope, and could that be done even more so? Would we see more women candidates call that out, like a Shirley Chisholm, if they weren't worried about winning? The challenge is, if you're a candidate who has little hope, you don't get as much attention. And so can you actually, in that cyclical process, are you in fact informing voters as much? And so that would actually be interesting to sort of study and look at in terms of cases. I did really quickly I meant to say to Ruth's question, there's a piece in the book about Jerry Askins and being a single woman, and I love that case because she very overtly with me was like, yes, everybody thought I was a lesbian, and so what I needed to do was, and she said there's an ad with her and a bunch of kids around her, and she talks about education, and she said I always had to be seen with kids, and then she had to have an answer for why she wasn't married, which was the children of Oklahoma are my family and my kids, and to add to that, I always wanted to be married, it just didn't happen for me. And so the questions are still asked. Now, I think it's different in Oklahoma than in some other places. But I do think candidates are still responding to those with strategy.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we'd encourage you to channel your curiosity towards the book sales table.
Hi, my name is Nihalaga, and I'm a wealth advisor from Princeton. My question is kind of more geared towards the election of the president. Mm-hmm. Okay, so like I'm from India, and I've seen, following history, and we have India and many other Asian countries, heads of government being women, not now, back in the 70s, and Thatcher in the 80s and 90s.
Sure.
I don't know when, but very, very famous prime minister. Mm-hmm. But it's got something to do with the way the election of the president is conducted over here, that you have to be elected separately, and in these other parliamentary democracies, what you have to do is the party nominates the prime minister.
Sure.
Versus here, the president has to stand alone as a person, and he's being voted over by the entire public.
Yeah. Yes.
So that is,
yes.
Is that got something to do with the structure? Because this thing has been baffling me for a long time. This country has been free from 200 years, and we have not seen a single president.
Yeah. No, I think the structural differences are significant. I also think, and I haven't done a lot of comparative work on this, so I don't want to speak for sort of other countries, but I do think the sort of gender expectations and how we talk about the presidency in this country is so masculinized. We talk about, the roles of the presidency as, the commander-in-chief and these very masculine roles, and we hold them up to the standard as these sort of great men. And we've seen that for so long. And I think those norms are really hard to break. And so we saw that in 2008, I think, with Hillary Clinton running, that even a woman who we would assume, when we talk about gender stereotypes, we say when somebody's really individualized, those stereotypes shouldn't be at play at much, right? They're used as cues. So everybody knows Hillary Clinton, so why are we going to critique her on gender dynamics? But in fact, I think it made people uncomfortable that she was running for this office that was the most sort of masculine office in our country, I would argue. And folks raised questions about whether she was fit for the role, in part, not in total, and I wouldn't argue that she lost because she was a woman, but in part because she was a woman candidate. And so I do think there's something about the presidency in our culture that has raised it as really, again, the most masculine office. And there's a lot of work on this, on masculinity in the executive office, particularly in the U.S., that I think speaks to that.
Are you familiar with the Black Swan effect?
The Black Swan effect? No, I'm not.
There's a book called The Black Swan, and
Okay.
that talks about everything is going around normally, but sometimes the Black Swan comes in and disrupts the entire process.
Okay.
So I'm not saying that because President Obama is black, but that's kind of the Black Swan analogy here, because if you look at Obama's campaign, it is very well, like, he was like a total underdog, and it almost kind of reflects how Lincoln came and became, from the underdog, he came to become the president.
Mm-hmm.
He was the least of the known candidates, least of the popular candidates.
Mhm.
So if it were not for Obama, she would have been the front runner from the Democratic side.
Mhm.
So I'm talking a lot of ifs and buts here, but that will change the entire.
Sure, I mean, that's a whole nother level. Although, right, he had his own, so he had to contend with, again, in terms of race dynamics, right, he had to deal with a whole nother level of, we don't assume a black man is president either. And so what did that mean for him? And it meant questions he had to answer to, and still does. Yeah, so, but
we're gonna end this, but I know Kelly will forgive me if I do this because we're on the same page about it. Because there's a room full of people here who are really interested in these questions. So I'm gonna recommend that what they do is have the good time that we've been having and look up a program on television, look up a series called Borgen, B-O-R-G-E-N, right? Is that okay that I'm promoting it? It is available on Netflix. You have to be willing to read subtitles, but it is an incredibly interesting series about a woman who is a prime minister in Denmark. It's the parliamentary system, so it speaks to some of this, but it is an absolutely fascinating. It's 3 years. It's a three-year series. Right. Don't you agree, Kelly? They should all read your book and watch Borgen.
I think you should read the book and then watch Borgen, yes, for sure. For sure.
B-O-R-G-E-N, Borgen. It's just about the best thing that I've seen on
And there's
a
some
woman
great
leader.
questions about family and all of the
Right.
things we talked about.
Right. It's fascinating. Kelly, thank you very much, and we're all coming back.